The strike that demolished Iran's B-1 bridge connecting Tehran to Karaj, described as the highest bridge in the Middle East, killing 8 people and wounding 95 others, according to initial reports, was followed within hours by Trump's statement that the U.S. military hasn't even started destroying what's left of Iran's infrastructure. That juxtaposition, a major bridge collapse producing mass casualties, followed immediately by escalatory rhetoric promising worse to come, describes a trajectory moving away from the diplomatic resolution Trump has been claiming is imminent for 2 weeks, rather than toward it. 3 days remain until the April 6 deadline that Trump set 10 days ago when he issued his second postponement. The pattern established over 35 days of this conflict suggests what happens when that deadline arrives Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And now we're going to examine what Day 35 has produced, what the destruction of civilian infrastructure reveals about operational targeting expanding beyond military objectives, what Iran's former foreign minister calling for Tehran to declare victory and make a deal tells us about internal Iranian assessment of strategic position, and what the 72 hours remaining until Trump's third self-imposed deadline will determine about whether this pattern of threat postponement escalation can continue or whether variables are accumulating that force deviation from the cycle. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. This analysis is for informational and educational purposes only and is not financial, legal, or investment advice. I'm examining publicly available information from multiple sources, and events in this conflict are evolving hour by hour as we approach a critical inflection point. Please do your own research and consult professionals before making decisions based on anything discussed here. If you're finding value in this analysis, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The B-1 bridge strike represents escalation in targeting patterns from military and dual-use infrastructure toward explicitly civilian structures whose destruction produces mass casualties without clear military value. A century-old bridge serving as the primary connection between Iran's capital and its largest neighboring city is civilian infrastructure. The justification U.S. officials offered to Al Jazeera's Rosalind Jordan that the bridge was used to transport materials for Iranian military drones describes dual-use rationalization that could apply to virtually any transportation infrastructure in a country where military and civilian supply chains necessarily overlap. Iran insists the bridge was purely civilian infrastructure, which, if accurate, would make the attack a violation of international law. The death toll from that single strike, 8 killed and 95 wounded, exceeds the total American military deaths in this entire conflict. The Pasteur Institute, a century-old medical research center in Tehran, was struck this week according to Iranian officials and international monitoring. The pharmaceutical facility Tawfiq Daru in Tehran was destroyed, with officials describing it as dealing a blow to the national medical supply chain by eliminating its research and development department. A desalination plant on Keshem Island in the Strait of Hormuz was knocked out of service. The passenger pier Shahid Haqqani in Bandar Abbas was bombed. Steel plants in Isfahan and Farrokhshar were hit. The targeting pattern that emerges from these strikes describes systematic degradation of civilian infrastructure that populations depend on for medical care, clean water, industrial employment, and basic transportation, rationalized through claims of dual-use military relevance that cannot be verified and that international law would question even if true. Trump's threat Monday to blow up all of Iran's desalination plants if a deal is not reached extends the targeting pattern to explicitly threaten water sources for millions of people. Annie Scheel, U.S. Director at Center for Civilians in Conflict, described Trump's threats as appalling, stating that destroying infrastructure essential for civilian survival would produce devastating impacts, including hospitals without power for life-saving care, illnesses from lack of clean water, and people completely cut off from communications. When asked about the illegality of targeting civilian sites, White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt stated that this administration and the United States Armed Forces will always act within the confines of the law, without addressing how destroying desalination plants serving civilian populations conforms to laws of war, prohibiting attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival. Javad Zarif, Iran's former foreign minister who negotiated the 2015 nuclear agreement, and maintains significant influence in Iranian political circles, published a statement Thursday calling for Iran to declare victory and make a deal, outlining a blueprint for how Tehran could seek settlement with Trump on terms acceptable to it. That intervention from a figure associated with diplomatic engagement, rather than hardline resistance, is analytically significant. Zarif's public positioning suggests recognition among elements of Iranian leadership that the current trajectory is unsustainable and that some form of negotiated exit is necessary, even if it requires declaring achieved objectives that were not the original war aims. The fact that such a statement can be published suggests it has at least tacit approval from factions within the Iranian power structure seeking off-ramps. The death toll has now exceeded 2,076 people killed and 26,500 wounded in Iran since February 28th, according to cumulative reporting from health authorities. Lebanon's casualties continue accelerating, with 1116 killed, including 121 children and 42 health workers. 13 American service members have been killed. The wounded American count has reached approximately 290, with significant numbers unable to return to duty. The human cost continues accumulating at rates incompatible with characterizations of a conflict approaching successful resolution through productive talks. The economic crisis that the third deadline is supposed to address has intensified to the point of producing emergency government responses globally. Brent crude hit $106 per barrel Thursday, a nearly 5% surge in a single day. The U.S. national average for gasoline officially crossed $4 per gallon, the highest since 2022. The S&P 500 dropped 1.74% Thursday, its biggest daily decline since the beginning of 2026, as oil price increases and war uncertainty combine to produce market volatility. The International Energy Agency warned that if the Strait blockade continues, global oil prices could reach $150 to $200 per barrel, potentially triggering global recession. The Philippines now has approximately 40 to 45 days of petroleum supply remaining. Multiple airlines are cutting flights as jet fuel prices more than double, with Philippine President Marcos stating that grounding planes is a distinct possibility. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's abrupt firing of the U.S. Army's top general and 2 other senior officers Thursday, described by Al Jazeera as prompting speculation of a wartime leadership shakeup, introduces command instability at a moment when operational planning for potential ground operations requires continuity and clarity. The timing, 35 days into a conflict where Trump has repeatedly claimed imminent victory while simultaneously deploying additional ground forces, suggests either dissatisfaction with military advice being provided or removal of officers expressing skepticism about achievability of stated objectives. Wartime leadership changes of this magnitude typically signal either preparation for operational escalation, requiring different command approach, or political intervention in military decision-making, producing turnover among officers unwilling to execute directives they consider strategically unsound. Iran claimed Thursday to have shot down a U.S. fighter jet over central Iran. The claim has not been independently verified, and U.S. officials have not confirmed any aircraft losses. Satellite imagery provided to CNN by Airbus showed the remains of a destroyed U.S. E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft after an Iranian strike on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, March 27th. The AWACS enables airborne monitoring of 120,000 square miles of battle space and has been a vital component of U.S. fighting forces for decades. The confirmed loss of an AWACS platform represents significant degradation of American ability to maintain airspace awareness over the theater. Satellite images also revealed damage to a critical ANTPY-2 radar at the same base, crucial equipment for the THAAD missile interception system. Iranian strikes have systematically targeted American and allied radar installations, creating gaps in the detection network that protects forces and populations from incoming missiles and drones. The weekend that passed, which Day 28's analysis identified as the first test of whether Trump's postponement pattern would produce Iranian operational moderation, produced instead intensified Iranian strikes across multiple theaters, confirming that postponements do not buy compliance. Iran's military spokesman stated the war will continue until enemies face humiliation and surrender, specifically cautioning against ground invasion. Foreign Minister Arakchi declared Iran ready for any type of attack, including a ground attack, and stated Tehran is prepared for at least 6 months of war, directly contradicting Trump's timeline of ending operations within 2 to 3 weeks. The gap between Trump's claimed 2 to 3 week timeline and Iran's stated 6-month preparation describes parties operating from fundamentally different assessments of leverage, sustainability, and acceptable outcomes. The 72 hours remaining until the April 6 deadline at 8 p.m. Eastern Time will determine whether the pattern that is held for 35 days continues through its third iteration or whether accumulating costs force deviation. The historical pattern established over 2 previous postponements suggests the most probable outcome. March 22nd, Trump issued a 48-hour ultimatum to obliterate power plants unless Hormuz reopened. March 23rd, 17 hours before the deadline, he postponed 5 days claiming productive talks. March 27th, he postponed again for 10 more days until April 6th, again framing it as per Iranian government request. Each postponement was preceded by Iranian refusal, combined with credible counter-threats, followed by Trump retreating while claiming diplomatic progress, followed by continued Iranian strikes demonstrating that postponements achieved nothing except buying Trump time to avoid executing threats. The April 6 deadline presents 3 possible outcomes: execute the threatened strikes on Iranian power plants and desalination facilities, which would represent major escalation targeting civilian populations, would likely violate international law, according to multiple legal experts, would produce mass civilian casualties, and would trigger Iranian retaliation against regional infrastructure, including targeting Gulf desalination plants serving allied populations. Issue a third postponement with another deadline extension, confirming the pattern that American ultimatums lack credibility and can be indefinitely deferred through Iranian refusal, further eroding any leverage the deadline mechanism was supposed to create. Declare that Iran has met sufficient conditions to avoid strikes without specifying what those conditions were, allowing Trump to claim diplomatic victory while leaving the strait effectively closed and all fundamental issues unresolved. The probability assessment for Sunday evening, April 6th, based on established pattern and current trajectory, suggests the third option, declared victory without defined achievement, as most likely. Trump stated Tuesday that the U.S. could be done with Iran within 2 to 3 weeks, a timeline that places conclusion between April 8th and 15th. He stated Monday he is in serious discussions with a new and more reasonable regime, despite no evidence of regime change beyond leadership succession after Khamenei's assassination. He claimed Iran is begging to make a deal, despite Iran's foreign minister categorically denying direct negotiations exist. The rhetoric describes preparation for declaring accomplished what was never clearly defined, allowing exit from a conflict where casualties and costs are mounting, while objectives remain unachieved. The alternative scenario that could force execution of threatened strikes, rather than third postponement or declared victory, requires variables that change Trump's political calculation about costs of retreat versus costs of escalation. A mass casualty Iranian strike producing deaths that American public opinion cannot absorb without demanding retaliation. Domestic political pressure from congressional Republicans reaching the point where postponement without execution damages Trump more than execution with consequences. Allied pressure from Gulf states whose infrastructure is being struck while American protection proves unable to prevent attacks. Or internal military advice reaching the conclusion that failure to execute after 3 postponements irreparably damages American credibility in ways that exceed the costs of escalation. The intelligence picture suggests Iran is preparing for ground combat rather than preparing to concede. CNN reported Iran has been laying traps and moving military personnel and air defenses to Karg Island, the facility processing 90% of Iranian crude exports. That defensive preparation indicates Iranian assessment that American threats of seizure operations are credible enough to warrant concrete defensive measures. Elements of the 82nd Airborne Division have arrived in theater. The carrier strike group consists of more than 6,000 sailors. Combined with Marines, U.S. ground combat forces in the region now exceed 8,000 personnel. That force posture describes capability for specific operations like cargo seizure, not capability for sustained territorial occupation or regime change through military force alone. Iran's parliament speaker stated Thursday that the country is waiting for American soldiers to enter on the ground so they can set them on fire. Rhetoric designed to deter ground operations by promising casualties at levels that would make political sustainability impossible. The Iranian Red Crescent Society reported that more than 600 schools and education centers have been hit since February 28th, describing systematic damage to civilian infrastructure that international law is designed to prevent. The GCC Secretary-General called for UN Security Council authorization of force to protect the Strait of Hormuz, an appeal that describes Gulf state assessment that current approaches are failing to reopen the waterway, and that international mandate is needed for operations Iran would characterize as acts of war. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. When Sunday evening, April 6th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time arrives, and Trump faces the decision to execute strikes he has threatened 3 times, postpone for a 4th time, or declare victory without defining what was achieved, the analysis will be here. When the 2 to 3 week timeline Trump stated Tuesday reaches its conclusion between April 8th and 15th, and the operational reality contradicts the claimed imminent ending, the analysis will be here. When the force posture that now includes more than 8,000 American ground combat troops in theater produces either operational deployment or political determination that deployment was deterrence theater rather than preparation for execution, the analysis will be here. This channel documents what officials say, what operational evidence shows, what the pattern of 3 deadlines and 2 postponements tells us about the 3rd, and what 35 days of documented escalation reveals about trajectories that communications cannot reverse through claims alone. Leave one question in the comments. When Trump has postponed twice after issuing ultimatums, when Iran has responded to each postponement with continued strikes, and when 72 hours remain until the 3rd deadline, which outcome appears most probable? Execution that has been deferred twice, postponement that confirms the pattern, or declared victory that defines achievement retroactively? Every response gets read.